All right. I want to think about, the lesson opens with God's law regarding divorce. Now, we will go ahead and look at Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19. Because it's going to set a stage for really the subject of marriage, because the attitude toward marriage in the days of Jesus was not particularly different than the attitude toward marriage today. And the more disturbing parallel is the attitude of marriage among the Jews in the first century, and how it can be seen in the attitude in the church today. And so, this matter of marriage is, marriage is the foundation of society at every level. It's the foundation of our communities. It's the foundation of our schools. It's the foundation of our government. And when marriage is not held in the highest regard, then the rest of society suffers. And so I want us to think about the subject this morning, particularly about the matter of marriage. Now we're going to begin in verse number 3 of Matthew 19, and then we're going to read through verse number 12. Matthew 19, verses 3 through 12. It says, "The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason?' He answered and said to them, 'Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate or put asunder.'" There's God's law on marriage. Right there. That's God's law on marriage. "A man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, the two shall be one flesh. And what God has joined together, let not man put asunder or separate." Verse 7, "Then they said to him, 'Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away?' He said to them, 'Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so.'" So now we find Jesus says from the very beginning, divorce was never part of God's plan. Moses permitted it, but from the beginning it was not so. Now verse number 9. "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality or fornication, and marries another, commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." Then his disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry." These are the disciples now. These are the, this is the 12. And essentially what they're saying is, if I can't divorce my wife for any reason I want, I'm better off not to marry at all. That's what they said. If what you said is the case, then it's better for a man not to marry at all. He said to them, "All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are those who are eunuchs, born thus from their mother's womb. And there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it." And so this is the most critical text in the Bible with regard to what God teaches on marriage. Now, there are a number of other pictures and teaching texts concerning marriage. Ephesians 5:22 to the end of the chapter 1 Peter 3, 1-7. The Bible talks about marriage in a lot of other places. 1 Corinthians 7, and we'll get to that at some point. But this is, in my opinion, this is the text that covers every possibility. In other words, some of the things, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about divorce in Matthew chapter 5. But he doesn't say everything there that he says here. So in other words, this text expands on what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and about verses 31 and 32. You've heard that it's been said, if whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorcement. But I say to you that whosoever divorces his wife causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries her, a woman who is divorced commits adultery. All right, well, that's also true, but it's not all the truth that Jesus would give us, obviously, later on here in this text. And the two texts can't be pitted against one another because the same guy said them both. And so, as we think about the subject, we want to see what the entirety of the text says about the matter. And so I want to think, first of all, about the subject of marriage and why it is so important. And first and foremost, the reason it's so important is because it's biblical. Scientists have tried to conjure up all these different ways to explain why human beings desire to marry. And they'll look at, they'll say, well, look at geese, geese mate for life, or look at this, or look at that, as if our idea about a desire, the desire to marry, came from some form of evolutionary process. Obviously, the problem with that is the creatures that they believe to be our nearest evolutionary ancestors don't practice that. And so, it's like, y'all came, you came, or we all came from apes. Now, but when it comes to marriage, I want you to look at the goose. I want you to look at the practice of the goose in order to figure out how you got to marriage, but don't look at your nearest evolutionary, ancestors. With apologies to the man over here whose nickname is Goose. So, but the matter of marriage is a biblical matter. In other words, God gave marriage. God, as we looked at last week, He originated marriage. He's the originator. He's the orderer of marriage. In other words, He gave it a line of authority. He gave it various appointments. In other words, marriage is to accomplish a number of things. And we'll talk about those just briefly in just a little bit. But the matter of marriage is biblical. So from Genesis to Revelation, some aspect of this relationship is mentioned. All right? In other words, we find marriage as a constant throughout Scripture. The first two people that were ever on the planet were married. They were married. Huh? The same person that married you? The same person that married you? Who married you? That's exactly what I'm saying. Jesus didn't say what the preacher has joined together, let not man put asunder. He said what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. God is the creator of every single true marriage on the planet. And it doesn't even matter if the participants know it. God joins them together whether or not they even believe in God. Right? I mean, if two atheists marry, neither one's ever been married, and two atheists marry, who joins them together? God does. God does. And so,
they don't have to believe that He does.
That's right. And so, as being joined together by God, they're also subject to every other rule that God set forth in marriage. Again, whether or not they know who God is, believe in God, or know what God says. In other words, our knowledge of God and His Word does not change anything about the subject of marriage. By the way, the fact that marriage exists all over the planet, ought to be some indication of, for lack of a better term, a higher originator of marriage, right? No, the fact that marriage is a part of every single culture should tend us to believe that God is the creator of marriage. Of course, and by extension, you could always take that all the way back. You say, well, how did that happen? You can go back to Genesis 10 and 11 with the Tower of Babel, where everybody went their separate ways based on the language that they spoke. When they found somebody that spoke their language, then they all clanned up together, and all those people were already believers in marriage, right? I mean, 8 people got on the boat, right? 8 people got on the ark. What were they? 4 married couples. 4 married couples. And so, this is a biblical matter. God joins in marriage those who have the right to marry. Ma'am.
I ask you a question.
You may.
Homosexuals. Now, how does that?
No right to marry. And I'm going to get.
Oh, you didn't get to it.
Hold. Just give me just a minute.
Okay.
I promise you, I'm going to get there. I promise you, I'm going to get there. All right. And so, to think about marriage in the home. Of the 3 God-ordained institutions, the home is the first. God gave us the home first, He gave us civil government second, and He gave us the church third. Those are 3 divinely originated institutions. The home, civil government, and the church. And they all of them, again, originated in God. God rules in the kingdoms of men, Daniel says. The authorities that exist are ordained by God. Romans 13 verses 1 through 7. And so God gave us these things. And then the study of marriage continues to be a very timely matter. Throughout the 60s and 70s, when the no-fault divorce came into effect, we're not that deep into history where people could just divorce willy-nilly. I mean, back in the day, you had to give a cause for divorce. And irreconcilable differences was not on that list. I mean, you had to give a cause for divorce. When you got divorced, like the paper said adultery. The paper said abandonment. Notice there was an express reason. In other words, people just couldn't go off and willy-nilly get divorced like they do now. But with this idea of no-fault divorce, in other words, we decide we don't want to be married anymore, then the divorce rate just exploded. It exploded. From like the 1960s to the 1980s, the divorce rate went up about 400%. In other words, about 4 times as many marriages ended in divorce in the 80s as ended in divorce, say, in the 1950s. All right, and so we're not that far removed, even in our societal history, where people just couldn't get divorced like they could go down and sign papers on a new car, or an ATV. It just wasn't that simple. Nowadays, and by the way, some of this material that I prepared is not that old. Okay, this material is only about 15. Some of this material that I prepared for this is only about 15 years old. All right, and some of it is already out of date, and I'll explain to you why. How many of us have heard the statement, half of all marriages end in divorce? We've heard that, right, for years. And from a pure numbers perspective, that number is true. At one time in the 1980s, there were actually more divorces in Houston than there were marriages. I guess that's because people were moving to Houston and married people were moving and then divorcing later. But the number of divorces outnumbered the number of marriages. But here's something we need to understand. Just because it is statistically true that half of all marriages at one time ended in divorce does not mean that half of everyone who marries will be divorced. You say, well, how does that work? How does that work? I'll explain to you. All right. How many times was what was her name? Elizabeth Taylor. I know I'm getting way past some of y'all's have no idea, but I hear Lisa laughing because it was always a joke about how many times Elizabeth Taylor had been married, right? Like 9 times, and 2 of them were the same guy. And I don't remember who it was. Was it Richard Burton she married twice? Okay. And so she was married 9 times. All right. So that means there's at least 8 or 9 divorces. Okay. So what does that mean if half of all marriages end in divorce? That means there's 7 or 8 couples over here on this side who married and are still married. You see how that works? I mean, 100% of her marriages ended in divorce. But to counterbalance that, to get it to 50, there had to be exactly the same number of marriages still intact on this side. Mickey Rooney married about 9 times, I think, if I'm not mistaken. 9 times. So that means those 2 involved about 20 people in a divorce situation, which means there's almost 20 couples over here, 15 or 20 couples over here that married and are still married. So that half of all marriages end in divorce is not the same as saying your marriage only has a 50% chance of survival. Statistically speaking, 70% of all people who marry are still married. In other words, they're still in their first marriage. That was true at one time. 70%. And so, my generation was indoctrinated with, if you get married, you got a half a chance of making it, and that just wasn't true. It just wasn't true. And so, look, even if 30% of the people that marry are divorced, that's still a problem. I mean, that's still a problem, right? I mean, if 3 in 10 marriages, if 3 in 10 actual marriages fail, that's still a problem. That number is still way too high. All right, and so we have that problem. Now, in the interim, when I first started preparing these statistics, now our problem is not so much the fact that there are marriages and divorces. The issue that we have now is there are no marriages. There are no marriages. I mean, look, and we live right in the heart of the Bible Belt, right? We live right in the heart of the Bible Belt. How many of you know someone under the age? And I'm just going to pull a number out of the hat, okay? But how many of you know someone under the age of 40 that shacked up with somebody? And I use that terminology intentionally. Know somebody under 40 that shacked up with somebody. We all do, right? In fact, we probably know a lot of people that are shacked up, not married, right? Now, 50 years ago, those people would have probably what? Probably would have got married. But now, because marriage is held in such low regard, and what God's plan for marriage, teaches is either unknown or ignored by so many, people just live together with impunity. They just live together with impunity. By the way, do you know who the highest, what age group is the highest group of cohabiting? Not probably seniors, seniors. 65 and up. The highest rate of people living together outside of marriage is among those over the age of 65. And there's one reason. Money. Because if they get married, their Social Security benefits get changed, lowered. Now look, that ain't, yeah, you lost money. Was he worth it? Okay, I just want to make sure. I probably should have asked him. I should have probably asked Dale, but that's, look, first of all, that's not right. You know, the government shouldn't punish people for doing right. And really the government, you know, well, I won't get into all that, but it's not right. To punish people for doing what's right, you know, is not right. But it's also not right to live together. I mean, end of discussion. It's not, you know, it's not right to live together. And so, you know, we're living increasingly in a society where people they just thumb their nose at marriage anymore. They just thumb their nose at marriage. And so, you know, it's something that we need. It's something we need to study. It's something we need to know. And then it's important because this is a matter that is relevant to salvation. It's relevant. You know, what God's law says about marriage is relevant to salvation. And the church is plagued in many areas, in many congregations, is plagued by this problem. All right, now, before I get into this, obviously, from the text I've read that not all you know, if you are divorced, that doesn't mean that you have sinned. Okay, because Jesus made that clear, right? In Matthew 19:9, he made it clear. You can divorce without sin. Okay? And I said that to preface my next statement. Yes, it is possible to divorce without you sinning personally. Right? But it is not possible for there to be a sinless divorce. And what I mean by that is there's no such thing as a divorce that takes place where there's not sin involved. Right? Because if you can divorce, according to what Jesus said in Matthew 19:9, if you can divorce and you not sin, what does it mean? The other person has sinned, right? In other words, so what you see how I'm dealing with this? There is a sin involved. The innocent party hasn't sinned, but there's a sin involved in the matter. Right? You know, if people divorce for, you know, because they fell out of love, the flame is gone, or whatever, that's a sin. It's a sin, it's a sin just to divorce for irreconcilable differences. There's sin involved. If you divorce because of abandonment, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there's sin involved. In other words, the abandoning spouse, the abandoning partner has committed a sin. All right, and so the Bible gives exceptions to the innocent parties to divorce without sin, but that doesn't mean that there's not some sin involved somewhere. All right, are we clear on that? That's why I wanted to preface it first, that there are people who can divorce without sinning, but there's still going to be a sin involved in that somewhere. And in most cases, it's going to be on the other party through abandonment or adultery, those types of things. Most Christians don't know what the Bible teaches about marriage and divorce, and they really don't understand what the Bible teaches about marriage. If there was more teaching and more attention paid to our marriages, then there would be a far less rate of divorce, particularly among Christians, right? In other words, the saying is, when we're taught better, we'll do better, and I think that's a fair statement. And it's not just true in marriage; it's true across the board. When we're taught better, we will do better. And so we want to teach what God's plan is for divorce, or for marriage, I'm sorry. Now, talking about getting to Kathy's question in a more technical way. She asked about, really it's the Dobbs decision back in about 2008 where the Supreme Court decided that people of the same sex could legally marry. All right? Yeah. Here's a news flash. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I don't care what 9 human judges say. I'm only concerned with the declaration of one judge. And that judge said, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Cleave to his wife. God does not recognize the marriage, the joining of homosexuals, because it denies the very basics, the very elements that are required for marriage. Now here's where I want to get to, like what Kathy was saying. Marriage is for one man and one woman. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined or cleave to his wife. That's what Jesus said, right? And he's quoting Adam. By the way, the interesting thing is, in Genesis chapter 2, the Bible says that Adam said that, right? This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called, a woman because she was taken out of man. And a man to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. By the way, what did Adam know about a father and mother? That's day one, y'all. That's day one for human existence is what I mean. It's day one for human existence. But the Genesis text says Adam said it. Matthew's text said that who said it? God said it. In other words, Adam spoke by the mouth of God. In other words, God spoke to us through Adam, and Moses recorded it, as Moses is the author of the book of Genesis. Now, I want to look at how the Bible uses certain words and how we use those same words in our society and even in a scientific realm. The word for marry or marriage in the New Testament is the Greek word gameo. 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 Right? In the world of biology, you have what is called a gamete. A gamete. A gamete is a male reproductive cell or a female reproductive cell. And when those two gametes come together in science, by the way, does anybody remember this in biology? What is it? What is the very first thing that when two human reproductive cells come together, it creates a what? And it's only it for a very short time. Zygote. When two haploid cells come together and make a single what's called diploid cell, when the male and the female come together, it creates a zygote, which then becomes an embryo. Okay? But it takes a gamete and an opposite gamete to make a zygote. By the way, you know what the word for yolk is in the New Testament? Zygote. Actually, it's zygos. We get the word zygote from the Greek word that means to yoke together. So marriage is the joining of two opposites, to yoking two opposites together. And to create whatever type of life that is created through what's called sexual reproduction, it takes a male and a female brought together. You can't bring two male gametes together, right? You can't bring two female gametes together. You have to bring a male gamete and a female gamete. They're called haploids. You bring them together, makes a diploid. Bringing two together and turning them into one. And Jesus said they are no longer two, but one. Now, isn't it interesting that the scientific community, 2,000 years after Jesus said these words, are using the same terminology in biology to talk about how life begins, how two things are brought together to create one new thing. And God's been saying that for a long, long time. He's been saying that for a long, long time. So to answer your question about homosexuality, it won't work. Look, the idea that homosexuals can marry denies 6,000 years of human existence. Denies 6,000 years of human existence. In other words, we've known for 6,000 years that two men can't get married. We've known for 6,000 years that two women can't get married. Now, in other words, this idea that men and women can get married is about 5 seconds old.
Well, my question was, is like, the vows God, puts together. Okay, now what kind of vows do they use? Because they get married too,
It doesn't matter.
They
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they say. They can say whatever they want to say. God doesn't recognize it. Because that's not what God said marriage is. A lot of them probably use the same vows that you might have made in your wedding. But it doesn't matter what they say. And it doesn't matter what the law says. The only thing that matters is what God's Word said. And God's Word, with regard to marriage, says one man, one woman. Right? One man, one woman. And so, by the very language that the Bible uses, it denies the idea that two men or two women can marry. Also, it denies the purpose of marriage. Initially, why did God make Eve? Initially. According to what the Bible says. Okay, but why did he make him? Why did he make her? It says it's not good what? For a man to be alone. It's not good for a man to be alone. That's the impetus. And then the solution is what? I will make him a helpmeet. One who answers to. Right? One who answers to. Men don't answer to one another in any way that women answer to men. Not psychologically, not physically, not emotionally. It doesn't work. It doesn't work on any level. God made woman to fill in the gaps for man. Right? Because it's not good for man to be alone. So first of all, woman was made as one who answers to, or as a companion. A companion. Again, biblically speaking, companionship. Number 2, procreation. Be fruitful and multiply. Right? Be fruitful and multiply. And so God gave marriage for the purpose, of procreation of the human race. Tell me, can two dudes do that?
They say they can.
Yeah.
They say they can.
But again, they can say a lot of things. They can say a lot of things, but it can't be done. It can't be done. By the way, I'll just say it because we're about out of time. I think it's dead wrong to let homosexuals foster or adopt kids. It's not God's plan for a child to be raised by two men or two women. By the way, that's another reason I think why it's important for us to keep our support for places like the Children's Home in Arkansas, because they're not subject, as a private entity. They have certain laws they have to abide by, organizationally speaking, financially speaking, but they're not required to turn those children over to homosexuals. So that's one reason why that type of work is a very important work for our for our people. I think it's wrong, and I got a feeling that we're going to start seeing the results of that error start multiplying themselves over the course of time, because there's no baseline. For,
If the kid is raised in it, that's how they think it's supposed to be.
It makes it acceptable.
right.
And that's the only
Well,
way-
I mean, giving
that's the only way
children
it's
to
gonna
homosexual couples is saying that two men or two women is the same as a man and a woman, and that's just not remotely true. Not remotely true. So marriage is given for companionship. It's given for procreation. We talked about this, I think, some last week or week before. It's marriage is the only acceptable outlet for sexual expression. Marriage is the only acceptable outlet for sexual expression. All right, and then it's biblical because the marriage bond pictures the relationship of Christ and the church. Think about how many times Jesus is referred to as the head of the church, like the husband's the head of the wife. Or how many times is Jesus referred to as the bridegroom? He's the bridegroom. The church is the bride. Paul spoke to the Corinthians about, I want to present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. And there's that marriage imagery. And all of that is destroyed by any perversion of marriage, whether it be through homosexuality, through disregarding what God says about marriage, attitudes, toward divorce. All those things destroy the picture, that God's painted for us in the New Testament.
Did we know if Peter married before becoming an apostle or not?
Sure, he did. Yeah, he was married. He was married. I believe that's Matthew 8. And when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, that was prior to the specific call to be an apostle. That was a little bit later on when he called Peter and others, but then he named them apostles after that particular event. Yes.